The Lavender Odyssey, Chapter 2, Getting to Know You. Micah L. found me at the Wilmington railway station. It was a joyous reunion. She phoned her dad, Ken Blanton, and he came and picked us up. He hadn't seen Micah L. for several years, and their relationship was a little rocky. But he seemed pleasant enough, other than it was a long distance to the station from where he lived in Newark. He made a few grumbles about that. My first impression of Ken was mixed. His teeth and smile were broad, what I call a Yank smile. He was tall and self-assured, although I was a little concerned when he lifted a glass of scotch to his lips while he was driving. Ken was a personnel officer at Goodrich. I'd met alcoholics before, but Ken didn't hide the fact. Neither did his partner, Joyce. We met her when we got to the bungalow. She was attractive, dark-haired, and dark-skinned. Ken had divorced several times. Mike L. had been a few months old when Ken and his newly married wife brought Mike L. into their family. He was actually her second cousin. We stayed overnight, and then we were on our way to New York to visit a friend. The friend's apartment was in Brooklyn. I'm not sure of its exact location. It was a nice enough place, but I couldn't understand why people would choose to live where it felt like buses were driving through the living room. The noise never let up, day or night, and the heavy vehicles on their way to the Brooklyn Bridge made the floor and walls rumble. The next day, we went to Port Authority bus station. We were tired after our all-nighter deal in Brooklyn and were sitting on a bench waiting for the bus to Canada. We had our carry-on bags between our feet, and both of us fell asleep. When we were startled awake by an announcement over the bus terminal intercom, Micah L. found that our rucksack had been stolen. "It has all my things," she exclaimed. "I checked the bins," I said, just in case they took what they wanted and dumped the rest. I rushed around the terminal checking bins, but no luck, and our bus was about to leave. Fortunately, Micah L. had her driving license and her bus ticket in her pocket. That was all she needed to cross the border. Ottawa was a breath of fresh air. We continued our romance in the little house on Cambridge Street, which I shared with other TM teachers. I introduced her to all my friends, and she got a part-time job at the TM head office. Tulips were in full bloom, and it was at the National Arts Center near Parliament Hill that I proposed to her, by this time with a ring. The diamond was a single carat, but it was a commitment that was important. In fact, from that time on, I never thought of us as two separate beings. "We were joined at the hip," Micah L. said. The 6 weeks we spent in Ottawa were absolutely blissful. That was when I found out she didn't know how to ride a bike and had no sense of balance whatsoever. She would fall off every time we came to a stop, and so cycling around the city became limited. I took her to all the places around the capital that had become a part of my life. While all this was going on, Mike Al was planning to pick up her kids and arranging our wedding. She felt it was important that we get married in the States. After a couple of months, we returned to the U.S., and our first port of call was Detroit, Micah Al's birthplace. We were going to pick up Iana, who was living with Holt and his wife, Anna Rose. They lived in a modest house on Still Street. Micah Al hadn't had a lot to do with her biological father. He had visited her from time to time when she was growing up. A small allowance that he gave to Ken paid for her violin lessons. But when she was older, she went to Detroit and presented Holt with a dime, which was the cost of a phone call, the lack of which was the cause of her mother's death, she said. What actually happened is unclear. There were several versions that fateful day. Michael's birth and her mother's demise. When we arrived, Holt and Anna Rose were watching Lawrence Welk on television. I remember that because it was the only time I'd ever watched the show. Iana waited patiently. She was 9, a sweet girl with dark brown hair and freckles. Holt invited me to accompany him to the store. I guess it was his way of getting to know me. The only thing I remember was him talking about Micah L's reproach for him concerning her mother's death and how he had once been a guard at a correctional facility. Sometimes I think I was worse than those I was in charge of in the can, he confessed. In Columbus, Ohio, we picked up Micah L's eldest, who was living at the TM Center in Arlington. Anne was 15, flaxen-haired, and a jock. Then there was John Leo Jr. He had been staying with his dad, but was now living in his car while attending high school. John was dark-haired with the same eyes as his mom and a hint of a mustache on his upper lip. When we arrived, he was with his girlfriend. John was officially under his dad's custody. It seemed he wasn't interested in coming to Canada. Our next stop was to pick up Barnaby. Barnaby was with his dad, Ron, different dad than John and Anne. They were living in Lancaster, Ohio, in a motel. Ron was a Brit that Mike Al had met while training to be a grad school teacher in Oxford, England. They decided to return to the States, as Ron had been trained as a nuclear technician, and there were more opportunities available to him there. However, Michael and he separated soon after Barnaby was born. Technically, theirs was a common-law marriage. Michael had full custody of Barnaby, and while she was in Switzerland, Ron was looking after him. This was the complicated family circumstances into which I was being introduced, and the next chain of events proved to be challenging. We arrived at the motel where Ron lived on the outskirts of Lancaster. Michael knocked on the door. Ron opened it and immediately began shouting, "You can't take my son away to a foreign country." Then he shut the door. It was then that we noticed a car driving away with Barnaby in the back. Who the people were, Michael had no idea. As far as she was concerned, Barnaby was being abducted. She called the sheriff's office. "My son's being abducted," she said. "I have custody papers with me." Within minutes, we heard the sound of a police siren. The cruiser drew up outside the motel. The sheriff was heavy-built, wearing a beige uniform, complete with gold star and Stetson. Michael gave him the custody papers. The sheriff immediately took out his revolver and with the court order in his hand banged on Ron's door with his fist. Ron opened. "They're trying to take my son to a foreign country," Ron protested. "I have a court order here, and I am here to enforce the law. I suggest you get your son back here as soon as possible, or I'm charging you with kidnapping." Within 10 minutes, a car arrived with Barnaby. Barnaby was 7. Once he had been deposited at the door and into Michael's possession, the sheriff left. We went into Ron's motel suite while he packed Barnaby's things, including a huge box of toys. As Ron was ranting about the situation, he pointed to me and said, "What is that?" I had my first taste of Ron's vindictiveness. There would be more to come. But at that moment, Mike Al was overjoyed to have Barnaby back again. Next, we had to pick up Mike Al's VW van. It was located near Athens, a small university town not far from Columbus. The van was not actually in the town, but in a self-supporting community. That was where I met Michael's friends, Sarah and Rebecca, and a character that went by the name of Pipe Man. He was an indigenous man with heavy mustache and long hair, Rebecca's partner. Michael had rented a house in the community, and her cousin John was supposed to be living there while she was away. But he had left without paying the electric bill, and the power had been cut off. The house was full of wasps, and we had to explode a bug bomb to kill them before we could enter. The place was in a state of disaster. The smell was atrocious. That was because the contents of the fridge were rotting. The job of cleaning the fridge fell to me. The house was unlivable, and so we stayed at Sarah's place. Sarah's house was memorable because the room where we slept was covered with a patchwork of blankets and clothes, hanging in every available space. Micah L. enthusiastically talked about meditation and how it could change the world. Sarah, who was a born-again Christian, complained, "If you don't stop talking about meditation, I'm going to ask you to leave." This remark was sobering. Nonetheless, while we prepared for our wedding, we taught several people in the community to meditate, including children. The wedding was at Midsummer's Day at the Congregational Church in Columbus. All the bridesmaids and matrons were to be organized. There were clothes for pages to be sewn. I even embroidered roses on Micah L's wedding dress. Looking back, there was an enormous amount of planning going on behind the scenes. To this day, I'm amazed at what my bride-to-be had accomplished in a few weeks. The wedding would include some Hindu elements added to an otherwise traditional Christian ceremony. I remember being given a last-minute task an hour before the ceremony, and that was to exchange $1,000 of silver quarters that Micah L. had saved into gold Austrian coronas. I put the coins in my inside breast pocket for safekeeping. They were exceedingly heavy. While this was going on, Micah L. was picking up the wedding cake and the flowers, gardenias and lilies of the valley. Sarah had made a boutonniere for me at the last minute and pinned it on my lapel. At the church, I was surprised to see how many people were in attendance, including Ken and Joyce. The photographer, David, was a friend of Micah L. His words after the ceremony remain in my memory. "Short but sweet," he said. Although for me, so much had happened that day. My feet never touched the ground. It was like being in a timeless state of bliss. The cathedral organist played Jean-Joseph Mouret's Rondeau from Symphonies de Fanfare, otherwise known as the theme from Masterpiece Theater. Afterwards, we broke a coconut on the doorstep of the church. Ken had reserved a room in a hotel for our honeymoon night. He and Joyce came over with a bottle of champagne. After they left, we sat on the bed with strawberries and chocolate, drank a glass of champagne, and fell asleep exhausted. Around midnight, we woke up and decided to get something to eat. Opening the door of the bridal suite, we tripped over a gang of motorcycles sprawled on the floor around the ice machine. "We know what you've been doing," they chanted, as we stepped between their languid bodies. The next day, with Anne, Iana, and Barnaby in the VW van, we drove to Canada. This was their first crossing into Canada as immigrants, and it was the beginning of our life together as a family.